All right, let's see if anybody shows up. Hey, it looks like we got a couple viewers. If you guys want to just share who you are on the chat, that'd be great. Thanks for joining us. Can you guys hear me all right? You know how to do the chat? As you can tell, it's just me tonight. There's no Phil. He's probably busy writing something or doing something productive, unlike me. Yeah, if you guys want to enter your names or questions in the chat section, that's going to probably be the only way I'll see them. So I started that way. I hope you brought some questions with you for tonight. Do you guys see the chat feature, or am I the only one who's not seeing anything pop up? In case you're wondering, we are broadcasting from my office at home tonight. This is where I do record some interviews with a trusty microphone here over the internet, and I do my daily devotional and most of my other work when I'm not in the studio with Phil and the gang. All right, why isn't the chat section working, guys? You guys, in the upper left corner of the Google Hangout, there's a little chat icon. If you hit that, it should open up a group chat panel on the right side of the video, and that's where you can type in messages and questions, things like that. There's only 7 of you right now, so we're not too busy, but if anyone has questions or comments or stuff they want to know about the podcast, I have some stuff I want to share with you guys, but I'd rather lead off with what you're interested in. So go ahead and put that in if you can. Do we need to call in technical support? 10 view. All right, guys. Anyone else have a way of sending messages this way? The other thing you can do is tweet. I have my Twitter open over here, so if you guys want to go to Twitter and just tag me on a question, we can do the chat that way. If you don't know, my Twitter handle is just Sky Jatani. So if you tag me in a tweet, I will be happy to as the forum by which we communicate. So it's SkyEJethani. Send me your messages over Twitter, and we can kind of bypass the Google Hangout chat feature, which doesn't seem to be working for some reason. You can even just tell me who's on. I mean, there's 10 of us now, or 11. So let me know who you are and who's watching or who's tuning in tonight. It'd be helpful. I'll give you guys a second to try to log in and get on the Twitter or the Google Chat feature on the Hangout. All right. Greg, it says there's several people using the YouTube chat feature. Can you see that? I'm not seeing it. All I see is one little nothing on here. Do I have to like reload that? I don't know why it's not showing up for me. I don't see anyone else's chats. Maybe it's all my shortcoming here. We're chatting a bit, me and Greg and Mariana. It's not coming up for you though, obviously. Yeah, the funny thing is I see the one thing that I posted, it has Phil's picture and it says welcome to the live stream, but I'm not seeing anything come up after that. So that seems kind of bizarre. Have you guys seen that one message that I put at the beginning? All right, Jonathan from Harrison, Tennessee. Let's do this. Can we just use Twitter? I hate to be cumbersome that way, but I can get the Twitter messages. For some reason, the Google messages are not showing up for me. So send me your questions or your input over the Twitter feed, and I'll try to go that way. Okay, yeah, weird. Megan, I agree. It is weird. I don't know why that's not working. So we'll just have to let the entire world in on our conversation, at least your end of the conversation via Twitter, and I will answer your stuff on the video. All right, so far it's not a ton of people, so we could have a intimate conversation if you guys want. I wanted to share you some things coming up on the podcast to give you some sort of an inside scoop on what we're working on, and kind of one big inside scoop. But before we get to that, I want to hear what your questions are. And if Phil's not here, he's obviously not here, I'd be happy to answer on his behalf if you have questions for him, if I know the answers, of course. I'm going to keep updating my my Twitter feed here. Okay. I can't see your message on the Google chat. So I'm Mariana. I'm Brazilian translator. I live in Ireland since 2010. That's interesting. Friend of the show for 3 years. Brazilian living in Ireland. And I'm curious, how did you even encounter the Phil Vischer podcast? I don't think I've ever been to Ireland, and I've never been to Brazil, and I'm pretty sure Phil hasn't because he doesn't like to cross over any large bodies of water. So, Mariana, I'm curious, how did you get introduced to the podcast? Megan says, I didn't come prepared. An intimate conversation on Twitter. Yes, I guess that is possible if you don't have any Twitter followers. All right. Looking for more updated questions. Otherwise, I will go on with some of the stuff that I was going to present to you guys, but I was kind of saving that for later. Hey, if you guys are just jumping in, by the way, some of you have come in late. The chat feature is not working for me on the Google Hangout for some reason, so we're asking you to send in your questions via Twitter. You just need to tag me on that. My Twitter handle is my name with no space, SKYEJETHANI, and I will take the questions via Twitter. So that's where we're going. Okay. Greg, I'm an associate executive minister for American Baptist Churches in Nebraska. We live in Omaha. I'm in Omaha all the time. I speak somewhat frequently at Christ Church in Omaha, which is part of my denomination, the Christian Missionary Alliance. So I know Omaha pretty well. It's a lovely city, which you don't always hear. But I really like it. So, and American Baptist Churches in Nebraska, I assume that is pretty big in the middle of the United States. Okay, so Greg's a minister. Oh my. JT says, I have to go shovel horse poop yet tonight, honest. So don't wait too long on those big announcements. You literally have to shovel horse poop? Because that's interesting. I can't say that too many. I mean, couldn't that wait till the morning? It's not going to go anywhere. Okay. Other questions, guys, you want to ask about the podcast or feedback even from recent episodes that you've seen? As you know, we've been changing things up a little bit. Phil has released some of the control over to me so that he can be freed up to work on his own stuff. So input would be great too. One time this happened to me, there was no one else was talking and I had to fill the silence. Yeah, that's actually part of a pastor's job, is to just fill the silence when no one else is talking. We have a lot in common with stand-up comedians. We just get in front of a crowd and do stand-up, only we try to be more thoughtful and serious. I'm not sure we're more prophetic, however. So, yeah, this happens. JT, yes, shoveling. There's too much to wait, even of poop discussion. End of poops discussion. Anyway, this could be Phil's butt segment if you bring it up again. Okay, Greg, how do you go about the process of collecting news stories worth following? I appreciate the suggestions in the Patreon, but how do you collect stories worth thinking about? Good question. I can't say I do it every day. It depends on my schedule, but a lot of mornings, my routine is get up, make a cup of tea, make my wife a cup of coffee, make sure the kids are on their schedule and moving along. And then I usually do two things in the morning. One is I write a devotional based on notes that I've been taking over time. I kind of know what I'm going to do the next day, but I sit down and actually write the devotional for the following day. And then the second thing I do is I go through my news feed, which is curated, based on keywords and things like that, or there's certain news sources that I tend to look at every day. And I spend maybe half an hour a day just going through the headlines and looking for the articles that pique my interest. And they can be on a variety of subjects. They're not just religiously kind of themed or even politically themed. And I use Evernote. It's an app that many of you are probably familiar with that allows you to kind of tag stories and then file them away. And I'll tag them under different categories, whether it's a story I might use in something I'm writing, or a story I might use in an upcoming sermon, or something for the podcast. And sometimes I'll forward those on to Phil and Christian if it's a thing I think we might discuss on an upcoming podcast. Content. And honestly, most days I'm lucky if I get 2 stories that I think are even worth my time. Occasionally I get a lot more than that, but it's about half an hour a day that I'll just go through my normal sites and my curated news feed. Occasionally something will come across Twitter that I'll find interesting, but I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter. And you may know that if you follow me, because I don't post a ton on there. And I certainly don't sit there and watch everyone else's feed of the junk coming through. So that's probably not a great answer, but that's about as detailed as I can get. There are a couple of authors that I really like, and some outlets like The Atlantic. I find even when I disagree with an author or I disagree with the piece in particular, it's usually thoughtfully done, which I appreciate. But The Atlantic has a regular contributor, or I forget her exact title there, named Emma Green. She does a lot of stories on faith, religion, evangelicals, and I find a lot of her stories really fascinating and helpful. There's also the Religion News Service, which Jonathan Merritt writes for regularly. Phil often cites their stories on the podcast. So there are some sites like that. Christianity Today, of course. But for the most part, it's what I curate into my my newsfeed app. Okay. Allsides.org. Yeah, it's a good source. Tell me about how you choose keywords. Well, part of it is just what's offered. Like I have evangelical as a keyword, or church often as a keyword. I have things keyworded that we would never talk about on the podcast because it's of personal interest to me, but not to anybody else. So sometimes there's a politician, like I'm fascinated by Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska, who I met, was it summer? Yeah, 2 summers ago, I met Ben Sasse. He a Republican. He's a really thoughtful guy. He's a Christian. And he was one of the first Republicans to vocally oppose Donald Trump, and has stood by that, which is probably why you don't see him in the press all that much. But I have him tagged because I'm curious about anything that he says or puts out there. So things like that. It's just stuff that gets my interest. There's certain authors or writers that I tag, like David Brooks from the New York Times, or Ross Douthat, also from the New York Times. Michael Gerson, Washington Post, who wrote that big article recently in The Atlantic on evangelicals. So there's certain voices that you kind of go to over and over again. All right. Have you ever read The Sacred Enneagram? If so, what did you think? I have not read that book. I am familiar with the Enneagram. Actually, the person who's super into Enneagram is Phil's wife, Lisa. And she's kind of been my initial source to that stuff. And she did a whole workup on me on that thing. It was really cool. So I haven't gotten super deep in Enneagram. I can see it's a very helpful tool for a lot of people. I think it's got another book, or got a book office the other day from a publisher, because now it's kind of a craze and it's everywhere. But yeah, I don't have a strong opinion about Enneagram. I find it is interesting. It's useful. It's becoming very, very trendy, which makes me wonder when that bubble is going to burst, or when someone is going to come out with some kind of it's satanic and stay away kind of book. But it's only a matter of time. Okay. JT, since you stopped video podcasting, your beard is beginning to whiten like mine. Is there a causal link? It's a good question. No, I think, let's see, it is kind of white, isn't it? And the weird thing is, this side is whiter than this side. I don't know why that is. Um, Part of it is, I don't know. One day I was home with my wife and I hadn't shaved in a while, and she just said, "Why you should grow your beard and see how it looks." So I did, and I was kind of curious at how much gray there really was. So I've kept it. I don't know. I might shave it off when we go away for spring break. Might just be a winter thing. I don't know. We'll see. It was something fun to do. Okay, what do you think of the church's golden age? How would this age stack up? I'm kind of what do you mean by golden age? Is that like a certain time period you're talking about? I haven't heard that phrase put on a certain, so specify that, Simon. Tim, what sort of pushback have you gotten from the evangelical industrial complex as you continue to write and speak against a lot of its core values? All right, yeah, evangelical industrial complex was a phrase I coined a couple of years ago in a piece I wrote about kind of the interplay between Christian publishing, mega churches, and the Christian conference circuit. I haven't gotten a ton of pushback, probably because I'm not a big player in the Christian industrial or the evangelical industrial complex. The funny thing is, I'll tell you a little inside story. I'll try to not name names. When I was writing my first book, The Divine Commodity, right here, I was actually asked by a publisher to submit a book proposal because they were interested in publishing me. I think they had seen some articles I'd written, and they said, if you want to write a book, send a proposal. We'd love to take a look at it. So I sent in a proposal to the publisher for that book and gave them a sample chapter or two. And the book, if you don't know, is really about the influence of consumerism on our faith. And they took it to their publishing team, and the publishing team looked at it, and I don't know how many weeks it took, and they finally got back to me. And the acquisitions editor, who was a lovely guy, said to me that the team loved the sample chapters. They love the book concept. They're fascinated by the whole Vincent van Gogh component. They think that the issue of consumerism in the church is a huge one. And then they rejected the book. And I kind of got whiplash. I was like, well, wait a minute. You said everyone on the team was really happy with the book, and then why don't they want to publish it? And what they actually said to me was, they're worried about biting the hand that feeds them. In other words, they were worried that my book was going to be critical of the very industry that is paying their salaries, and therefore they were gun shy about publishing it. So I think within the evangelical industrial complex, there's a lot of people who recognize kind of how broken it is and how weird it is and how unhelpful in many ways it is to the general mission of the church and the edification and maturing of the people of God. I think they get that, but they're caught in the system and feel powerless to really change it. So as far as pushback, I haven't gotten a ton of pushback because I think people even inside the evangelical industrial complex recognize it's a problem, but they're inside it, so they can't really criticize it. And therefore I'm outside of it largely and can criticize it. And so I think some of them are actually grateful that I do, and I'm not the only one, but there are other voices out there doing it. So, yeah, I haven't gotten a ton of pushback on it, but again, I'm an outsider, so it's a little bit easier. Okay, now we're getting some more stuff. Okay. Greg says his 10-year-old daughter, Sophie, has a question. I love that name, Sophie. Why do you want to become an author? Or why did you want to become an author? Well, there's two ways to answer that question, Sophie. There's the kind of really godly answer, and then there's the really kind of profane answer. So the godly answer is, I think probably since the time I was a middle school student, to go all the way back, I recognized that I had some ability to write and to communicate, and I enjoyed it. And I grew in that ability as a high school student, and certainly as a college student, I did a lot of writing. And when I went to seminary, we had to do a number of different internships in seminary, and I did those, but I always wanted to do an internship using my theological training in the realm of writing, but I could never find an outlet for it. And so finally, once I was a pastor at a church and I was teaching and doing a lot of church leadership stuff, there was a big conflict that kind of erupted in our church, an internal conflict that got kind of ugly. And I wasn't involved in the conflict, but it sidelined a lot of the work I was doing at my church. And I would come home every night And I started complaining to my wife about what was going on at the church and wondering, should I stay? Should I leave? Should I pursue something else? And so I was doing this every night. And finally, Amanda, my wife, said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I wanted to do more writing, but I've never had an outlet or an opportunity to do that. And being much wiser than I am, she said, well, why don't you pray about that and see what happens? So I did. And within 2 weeks of beginning to pray about that desire to write more and an opportunity to do so, God opened a door for me to go to a retreat that was led, it was a retreat for all the vice presidents at Christianity Today magazine. And they brought me in as a younger pastor at the time because they wanted my input and feedback on their magazines. And out of that, they invited me to start writing for them. And that became the beginning of my writing career. So the godly answer is it was a gift I thought I had. It was an ability that I wanted to cultivate, and I prayed about it, and God opened the opportunity. So that's how it happened. It wasn't like I had some big strategic plan from the time I was 16 years old and followed this. I had no plan. It just opened up. When it comes to becoming really different. So the backstory on that, I already mentioned that on my first book, I had a publisher come to me and ask me to submit a book proposal. This is probably too much information, but when I was working at the church full time, and then I got an opportunity or an offer from Christianity Today to come work for them, I was super excited about that opportunity. And I said yes before I did my due diligence in asking Christianity Today what my salary would actually be, only later to discover that I was actually going to be taking a pay cut, going from my associate pastor role at the church to my editorial role at CT. It never even occurred to me that I could make less money than I was making at the church. So I didn't ask the question. So I was kind of shocked when I discovered I was taking a pay cut going from the church to Christianity Today. And so when this editor came up to me, this acquisitions editor at a ministry conference came up to me and said, hey, you should submit a book proposal. The first thought that honestly went through my mind was, yeah, I need to be making some extra money to make up the difference between the pay cut and to support my family. So I jumped at the book opportunity, not because I was super eager to write a book, but because I thought, well, maybe I can make a little money on the side. And isn't it ironic that I ended up writing a book about consumerism because I needed the advance, and it was not much money. In fact, that book, Divine Commodity, I get a royalty check once a quarter for that book, and it's probably about enough to take my family out to dinner. So it's not a big money maker by any means. But so there's the really ungodly answer combined with the godly one. Okay, let's see. Jonathan really enjoyed Divine Commodity. Thank you. It's actually my favorite book that I've written. It took me 18 months to write that book. It's really bizarre. It's been my lowest selling book, but as a writer, I actually have a strong affinity for it. Simon's asking, who's my favorite Avenger? Oh, man. I'll tell you what, Black Panther was pretty dang good. I don't know if I would have said that 6 months ago or 6 weeks ago. If you guys haven't, you need to check out the Movie Proposal podcast that I do with Josh Lindsay, because we review a lot of these superhero movies, and we did one on Black Panther, which was kind of cool. So that's up there. I mean, you gotta love Tony Stark just because he's such a scoundrel in character. Okay, Marianne, I just realized I didn't tag you. I was desperate for ideas for family devotions. Googled family devotions, came across the episode that you guys had years ago talking about your personal devotions and family devotions. And I knew Phil from What's in the Bible. Phil actually created, I don't know if you saw this, I don't know, 6 months ago, whenever it was, when he was talking about it more on the podcast, but he's created a video-based family devotional curriculum called Faith Blocks, BLOX. I don't know how old your kids are, but if they're on the younger side, that would probably be a really good resource for you. My youngest is 10. My oldest is almost 16. So we're kind of in a very different age frame for that. So one thing I do with my kids less regularly than I should is we do use the Bible Project videos quite a bit for basic instruction about, just what the Bible is about and learning the basic narratives and content. It's not necessarily devotional, but it does lead to good conversations. Megan says, I'm also an author. Writing is so hard, especially when you're doing it all on your own. I actually think writing is a heck of a lot harder when you're doing it with other people. It's one of those things that when I'm alone, it is hard no matter what, but trying to mesh two different minds in a writing project can be really challenging. So if you think it's hard by yourself, try doing it in a group. Thanks, JT. Yes, people should check out the movie proposal. Okay, let me pause here and give you guys. We got 15 viewers, and some of you are probably wondering what on earth we're doing. I can't get the chat feature to work for me for some reason on Google Hangouts, so we're doing the questions via my Twitter handle. So if you want to ask me a question, go on Twitter and tag me on it with my handle. It's skyjetani.com, no spaces. SKYEJETHANI. I'm a little under the weather. My voice is going, so pardon me for the frogginess. And the hot tea's helping a little bit. As more questions come in, I want to pause and just give you guys some updated news on what we're doing with the podcast. First, about some upcoming guests that we're going to be having, some interviews that we're trying to schedule. Just yesterday, I got this in the mail. John Walton's new book, The Lost World of the Flood. You might be familiar. We've had John on numerous times. He's a member of our church, the church Phil and I attend. He's an Old Testament professor at Wheaton College. He wrote The Lost World of Genesis 1, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, The Lost World of the Conquest, and I think this is the fourth book, The Lost World of the Flood. I'm about halfway through it. I mean, I've skimmed it quite a bit since yesterday, and really, really fascinating. So we're hopefully going to schedule John on in the next month or so on the podcast to have a deeper dive into the flood and his view of that. And his co-author, I don't know, Tremper Logman III. He's at Westmont College in California, so he will not be live in studio, but John probably will be. A lot of people get bent out of shape about the flood and the whole claim that it's a worldwide phenomenon, and how do we, make sense of that? And is it literal? Is it a figurative, metaphorical story? And I think John's view on that would be really, really helpful for people to engage in. We've gotten great feedback when he's been on the podcast before, so you can expect that. Later on this week, on Friday, actually, I'll be doing an interview for next week's podcast with Theon Hill, who's a professor, I think, of communication at Wheaton College here. And we've had Theon on the podcast before. We had him on to talk about different race issues that were going on from his point of view. He's African-American. And he's done a lecture recently and a paper recently on the topic of how Black rhetoric, how African-American rhetoric, going back generations, is actually is the right format to help us think through the way we should be communicating in the age of Donald Trump and kind of this fake news, post-truth kind of environment in which we're in. So we're going to have a conversation about that on Friday, which you can hear next week. Tomorrow, there will be a podcast that goes live that features me, Phil, and Christian talking about whatever it is in the news lately. And then the second half of that, we're going to have Drew Dick back on to talk about what we're jokingly calling Dick's Picks, where he refers to a number of books he's been reading and insights from those books. And the two books he mentions for tomorrow's episode are really interesting reads. And we're trying to curate for you guys what we think is worth your time from the evangelical industrial complex that turns out a lot of garbage. We think there's some good stuff in there. And Drew's really the one who's helping us weed through those things, and not always Christian books, sometimes non-Christian books. But I think he's got a really sharp insight on stuff that's worth your time if you're going to be reading. I'm trying to think of who else we have. Oh, this is an interesting one. So I met a guy last year at a Q conference named John Ward, W-A-R-D. He is the politics editor for Yahoo News. And he grew up in an evangelical home. He's a Christian guy, really fast. I sat down with him for a couple of hours one night at a restaurant bar kind of social thing and had a fascinating conversation with him. So John Ward has just written this really lengthy article about Eric Metaxas, and it's kind of gone all over the place because he interviewed Metaxas about his ongoing support for Donald Trump, and Metaxas wrote back, and the whole correspondence is now available online. And to put it mildly, Eric did not like the article that John wrote in response to their conversations, and it's created some tensions, let's put it that way. But it was fascinating nonetheless. And John has agreed to come on the podcast, and we're going to be interviewing him probably in early April, not just about the Eric Metaxas thing, but his view of the political world, and particularly coming from a Christian point of view. And what does journalism mean as a Christian, and how does he navigate those waters? So another really fascinating guy that I think you guys will like quite a bit. I have more announcements, but let me go back to the Twitter feed here. Okay. Tim, what's your go-to tea? That depends. In the morning, it's usually Earl Grey, but not any Earl Grey, because some Earl Greys are really terrible. I do like Twinings Earl Grey. I used to get P&G. Is that what it's called? Yeah, P&G tea, which is from the UK. It's like the most popular tea in the UK. But I noticed that it was significantly staining all of my cups. And I thought, that can't be good for my teeth. So I stopped that. So Twinings Earl Grey in the morning. In the afternoon, I'll often have like a French vanilla tea. Tonight, it's just a chamomile vanilla caffeine-free thing, because I don't want to be up all night. Okay. Simon, a while ago, you said you wanted to avoid using militaristic language when talking about Christian faith. How do you think this applies to politics, if at all? Huh. Yeah. Good question. I think in general, militaristic language should probably be to age. Obviously, you can't avoid it when you're talking about wars and military engagements, things like that. But I think when we employ that language in other areas, I don't know, maybe sports, because that's kind of a competitive thing, and there's always been a lot of overlap between competitive sports and military conquest. But I think when you apply it beyond those realms, it just isn't very helpful. I think it's very triumphalistic. You don't really see it much in the New Testament. The closest you probably get is when Paul talks about a soldier who fights to win, but there isn't a lot of that kind of language that's used as a metaphor for our calling in Christ. And I think in our politics, given how contentious and divided it is, it's not probably going to help heal those divides by referring to those you may disagree with as enemies who are to be crushed and destroyed. Yeah, so I don't think it's super helpful in political discourse either. Megan asks, and you find another book that made Phil as mad as that lion conquering your dreams one? I'd have to ask Phil. I don't know if he's come across another book that's made him as mad as that. I'm trying to remember what the title of that one was. It was by Mark Batterson, but I'm sure we can look it up on Google or whatever. But yeah, that one got under his skin, didn't it? Mariana says, I remember Christian mentioned that she played Clash of Clans. Do you play any games, video games? I get addicted pretty quickly to mobile games. No, not really. My son is now currently addicted to Fortnite, along with, I think, pretty much every other teenage boy in the United States, or maybe the world. So I see that game quite a bit, but I don't play it because I lost all the ability to move that quickly on a video game, and there's too many buttons on these controllers these days. I used to play the Lego games when my kids were younger, the Lego video games, like the Lego Star Wars games, that stuff, that I could manage, like on a Wii or something, but everything's gotten way too advanced for me now. So I'm not much of a video gamer. Okay, other questions? Again, for those of you who are just joining us, we're doing questions via Twitter. Just grab my handle on Twitter and send me a question. It's Skye Jethani, SKYEJETHANI. I have a cold, so that's the strangest. And for those of you, again, who are just joining us or jumped in, this is my office at home. So just out that door is a bathroom, the kitchen, and I think most of my family probably watching episodes of The West Wing from Netflix as we speak. But yeah, this is where I work. Most days my dog is on that blanket right there when no one else is home. He stays here with me. On the back wall, you can see there's a big reflection of my bookshelves, but that is a reproduction of The Prodigal Son, Return of the Prodigal Son by Rembrandt, which was a wedding gift from my brother, which is kind of ironic because he is sort of the family prodigal. Yeah, so this is the office for those who are wondering. Okay, I don't see another question coming in right away, so I'm going to go on with some announcements and news. And here's the big one. it's kind of half an announcement because I'm not going to tell you everything right now, but hopefully this will provoke some response because I'd love to get it. So here's the big news. As you know, Phil has stepped back from some of the podcast responsibilities because he's got all these projects on his front burner right now that are taking a lot of attention. I've stepped in to fill some of that vacuum by coordinating more of the podcast and getting more of the guests and kind of the second half of the show. We've been batch recording some of the opening segments. Like yesterday, we recorded this week's and next week's segments with me, Phil, and Christian, again, just to free up scheduling. I think it's working pretty well for everybody. I don't mind stepping up and doing more. We've got a lot of other ideas in production, but Phil and I sat down, it was about 2 weeks ago, to discuss where everything's going. And this is kind of an ongoing conversation we've had for years, but we just never pulled the trigger on it. But sometime into the podcast, maybe 2 or 3 years in, Phil talked to me about changing the name of the podcast because if you don't know the history, the whole reason this podcast began was because Phil wanted to do a television talk show. That's why he built that studio set that you used to see in the podcast on YouTube. So yeah, we're going to do a video television show that he did a couple of pilot episodes for and was hoping to get it broadcast on some Christian channel. Well, that didn't happen. And so in the meantime, we started doing the podcast. And the show was the Phil Vischer Show, and then it just became the Phil Vischer Podcast. But as things kind of evolved over the first couple of years, Phil began to realize that I'm just as much a part of the podcast as he is, despite not singing the opening song or playing the ukulele. And so he started thinking maybe we should change the title of the podcast so it's not just the Phil Vischer Podcast. And I was sort of indifferent, but we toyed around with different names, but we didn't really do anything with it for a bazillion reasons. But we came back to that conversation a few weeks ago, and he and I are in agreement that we are going to change the title of the podcast. And I think I know what the title is going to be, but I'm not 100%. So we're not prepared to tell you what it is, which means we're also still open to ideas and suggestions. So I can tell you two things for sure. It's not going to be the Phil Vischer Podcast, and it's not going to be the Sky Jitani Podcast. So it's going to be something else. And that's kind of the big news. I was hoping to have more for you, like here's definitely the new title, but we're working on it. We need to get some art created. I think we know what it is, but it's not too late to get your suggestions in. So if you guys have ideas, pass them along. We'd be open to that. Megan, no ukulele, no title. Is that a threat? Like if we get rid of the ukulele, there's no title? Or are you suggesting that no ukulele should be in the title? Okay. Tim says, I'm a college student about to graduate and enter the real world. It's not as real as you think. And that means finding a new church. What sort of things should I watch out for to avoid? And what you've labeled vampire churches. How do I find a healthy church home? Okay. Good question. It's hard to kind of answer that when I don't know where you live. And even if I did, I probably wouldn't know the churches in the area. Yeah, the thing I would look for are leaders in the church who genuinely are focused on blessing and equipping the people of the church to have a self-sustained, intimate communion with God. In other words, a communion with God which isn't just reliant on the church programs and Sunday morning, but actually equipping people to live with God throughout their week. And then secondly, church leaders that are focused on helping people follow God's calling for their lives in their world, rather than merely using people to advance the institutional objectives of the 501c3 organization we call the church. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't an appropriate place for church leaders to invite people to serve and to give and to participate in the shared life of that congregation. That's absolutely great and necessary. But I would keep my radar open for that. And then there's the obvious things like faithfulness to Scripture, faithfulness to orthodoxy, good character. A big, huge red flag for me would be a church or church leaders that rely on fear or anger as a regular device to try to motivate and push people ahead in their faith. Fear and anger are very common, and they're not fruit of the Spirit. So look for leadership and a leadership culture in the church that is marked by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. That's a short answer. Difficult question. Okay. Oh, I love this. The End of Western Civilization podcast. Lovely. Mariana says the Phil Vischer and Friends podcast. Not actually a bad thought. A little lengthy. Like What's in the Bible with Buck Denver and Friends. Yeah. I see the connection there. Megan says, more like if you don't play the ukulele, you don't get to have a podcast named after you. Oh, I see. I like Funny Think Christianity, or you mean Funny Thinky Christianity, like Phil has in the show description. The subtext is how I knew I would resonate with the podcast. Yeah, I think that captures it pretty well. I will tell you that the name that we're most gravitating toward right now would probably continue that theme, the kind of wink, if you know what I mean. It wouldn't. I think one of the hallmarks of our podcast that I really appreciate, and I think audience folks that I've talked to appreciate, is obviously when you have Phil constantly doing his butt segments. So the title we're leaning toward will have that wink to it, that playfulness that I think is indicative of what we do. Oh, JT, that's a mouthful. The Five Vishtani podcast. That actually kind of sounds like a Hindu goddess or something. Phil and Sky podcast. Yeah. Again, we'll see. I think our names are probably going to stay out of it, but we'll see. It's an option. A podcast with, in quotes, Sky, Phil, and Christian. Yeah, I don't know if you can actually trademark a preposition like with. You may not realize this because most of you are probably not in the publishing world, but book titles are not trademarkable. So I can't trademark the title with and forever in perpetuity own that preposition. So it's a difficult label to use as kind of a brand signifier. The God Pod, Simon chimes in. Not bad. So Megan, you're really a big fan here of Plinky Pete, aren't you? Yeah. Well, we'll see. I mean, as long as Phil's a part of this podcast, I'm pretty sure there's going to be ukulele involved in some form or another. So you're safe. Don't worry. Okay, other questions you guys have? We have about 15 minutes more. That's it for the announcements on my part, unless you guys have specific questions and you're able to pull more information out of me. Mariana likes Plinky Pete too. Okay. We should have a Plinky Pete fan club. I actually do have some other stuff I can let you in on that we're working on, but I'm a little hesitant because it's so early. I don't want to get your hopes up. But other questions you guys may have about me, Phil, the podcast, what's going on with future episodes, or requests? Are there certain people you would love to have us try to interview or get on the show that you think would be a good fit for our audience? Be very open to that too. The other thing I would be curious to know from you guys is what other podcasts do you listen to? Are there other Christian voices out there in the podcast ecosystem that you think mesh well with what we do on our show? Because we're always looking for like-minded people to share ideas with. Megan says, last question. As an unpublished author, what is the best way to connect with the publishing industry? Conferences, classes, anything? Ooh, Megan, you're not going to like my answer. The reality is it's a heck of a lot harder to get published in the Christian world today than it used to be. I was really fortunate that I wrote my first book back in 2008, and I was pretty unknown other than the fact that I'd written some articles for Christianity Today and was speaking a little bit here and there. But I'm not a mega church pastor. I'm not a celebrity of any stature. So back then you could still get a book published if you had a good idea and you were a good communicator. That's really rare these days. I know people in the Christian publishing world, good people, and the number of books that are being published is in some cases half or less than half than they were 10 years ago. And many Christian publishers are far less worried about your ability to write and your ability to communicate important, relevant ideas or biblical truths. And what they are primarily concerned about is how big is your platform? Do you have a mega church? Do you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Twitter followers? Because at the end of the day, you got to remember it's a business, and they want to be able to slap your name on the cover of a book and guarantee they're going to sell at least 10,000 of them in the first year, period, if not more. The dark side is if you can't put together a coherent sentence, but you are a preacher at a mega church, they'd be happy to take your sermon notes and hand it over to someone like me, frankly, pay them to write the book for you, put your name on it, because they know if you've got 20,000 people showing up at your church, a good third or half of that are probably going to buy the book the first week it's released, and they're guaranteed a profit. So the sad news is, for an aspiring author, if you don't have a big platform, it's really, really hard to get published these days. The good news is, as an aspiring author, is that you now have more options than just traditional publishing. If you really are a gifted communicator and writer, you can self-publish, you can e-publish. And if you end up doing that and selling or distributing quite a few copies, that can get the attention of a traditional publisher, who then will come in and say, oh, well, Megan wrote something. It's an ebook on Amazon. It's sold 10,000 copies for $2 a piece. And that's a pretty good track record. It's gotten great feedback. Why don't we buy that from her and publish it traditionally? And we know that there's an audience for it because it's already been tested in this other lower risk format. So there are other options for you. But the name of the game, sadly, is audience aggregation and platform building. And right now, a lot of the traditional publishers are worried because Amazon is coming in and undermining their whole business model. And that's why they keep relying on megachurch pastors to churn out books based on sermon series, or Christian TV celebrities from reality TV series and things. And some of those, they're fine people, but this is the truth. I sat with an executive of a Christian publisher, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago at a conference at in the presidential suite of a hotel where they were hosting this conference. And they would invite authors up to hang out in the suite. And this executive said to me that in today's Christian publishing world, a writer like Eugene Peterson would never get published. Eugene Peterson, if you don't know, is a pastor, wrote the Message translation of the Bible. He's written phenomenal books about ministry throughout his whole career, one of my favorite writers. But he said in today's publishing world, Eugene Peterson would never get published. Even though he's brilliant and he's a fantastic communicator, his church was never a mega church. I don't know how many people it was at its height. It was just a few hundred people. And that would not have gotten the attention of today's Christian publishing world. So sadly, it's not about the quality of the writing anymore. It's about how marketable is the person's name on the cover. So it's sort of an indictment, frankly, of some of the Christian publishing industry, but that's how it works. When I was writing with, I had a literary agent that was helping me shop that around to different publishers. And she came back to me at one point and said, how determined are you to release through a Christian publisher, or was I open to going with a non-Christian publisher, one of the New York publishing houses? And I asked her why. And she said, well, to be honest, you're more likely to get a good deal from a New York publishing house than you are a Christian publisher. And I said, well, this is a Christian book through and through. I mean, why wouldn't I go with a Christian publisher, or why wouldn't they be interested? And she said, frankly, the Christian publishers are more focused on name recognition, which I didn't have, than the New York non-Christian publishers that are more interested in just interesting content. So that's kind of sad, but that's part of the reality of the marketplace. Celebrity carries a huge amount of influence in the Christian world, and sadly, sometimes much more than in the non-Christian world. So, hey, you're a supporter on Patreon, so I'm giving you the unvarnished truth. Jeremy says, I received your new book, Immeasurable, today. Can't put it down. Absolutely brilliant. Well done. Thank you. All right. Shameless plug then. That's Immeasurable. For those of you who haven't seen it, you can get it on my website. That I did with Moody, which is a whole nother story, but that was a good experience working with them. Greg says, in addition to yours, we listen to the Bible Project and My Strange Bible. I do too, not all the time, but I kind of pick and choose based on the subject matter and the passages being talked about. I love the Bible Project, as you guys know, huge fans. Bible for Normal People, Peter Enns, I listen to that too. Don't always agree 100%, but really thought-provoking, wonderful stuff. Kingdom Roots with Scott McKnight. I didn't know Scott McKnight even had a podcast. He's a friend. We've had him on the podcast. I'll check that out. Radio Lab, yeah. And baseball podcast. Oh my gosh, baseball podcast. Baseball's boring enough. I can't imagine you'd want to listen to podcasts about it. JT, nice photo. Is that you getting ready to shovel some manure? Very entertaining. Megan says, Art of Manliness podcast. Not necessarily Christian, but good stuff. I have not listened to that. She said, oh, I write for kids. Is it the same? Good question, because I do not write for kids. You know what? That would be a much better question for Phil, because he does some children's. In fact, some of the writing projects that are distracting him from the podcast right now are children's books. So I can't tell you for sure. I can tell you this. So the Christian children's book industry, like other parts of the publishing industry, can be very trend oriented. It unexpectedly gets a lot of attention, and suddenly there's like 50 duplicate copycat style books. So sometimes it's hard to convince a publisher to do something truly new in that area, because they always look at what's worked in the past. You said my current project is along the Bible Project lines. Well, if it's along the Bible Project lines, that's a good thing, because they're a great resource. Okay. Yeah, I know. So where is he? Tell him we need to talk. Yeah, I will pass along your question, or you can tag him on Twitter and maybe he'll answer you that way. Would be the best way to do this. Okay, we have a couple of minutes left. So let me tell you one of the other projects that we're working on, which will probably be available to our Patreon subscribers first. One of the most downloaded episodes we ever did, not the most, but close to the most downloaded episode we ever did, was on the history of the religious right. And I can't remember how long ago that was, maybe a year and a half ago. Yeah, it was during the 2016 election, so probably about a year and a half ago. It was based on a class that I taught at my own church. Phil was there and thought the content was interesting, so we ended up doing a podcast where we kind of outlined the history of origins of the religious right. Massive response from you guys from that episode. So we are currently in the early stages of creating a downloadable resource, a visual resource that would be kind of like a PDF kind of document. I forget how many pages it is right now, but kind of an illustrated guide of the history of the religious right, so that you can use that in a small group or in a teaching environment, or just for your own wonderful edification. And then based on that, we're going to try to take some of the money you guys have used to support us via Patreon and actually create a video that illustrates that content. And if it goes well and we get a strong enough response from that content, we would like to replicate that with some other topics. So the pattern might be that we test out certain content on the podcast, see what our audience is really hungry for and wanting more of. And then when we kind of gauge that as being sufficient, green light the creation of a resource like that PDF or the slides and the ebook kind of thing, and then create a video along with it and begin to expand the library of content that we're producing based on the podcast and our audience. So that's in the very early stages. I'm hoping to, actually, we just talked to an artist yesterday who's helping us with some of that work. But I'm kind of excited about that, because I feel like some of the content that we have presented on the podcast is rich and good and valuable, but as much as you can go back and listen to old episodes, I think it'd be great to put that content in other accessible formats that you guys can share via social media, that you can use in your churches and small groups and schools to disseminate, and kind of keep pushing forward on these resources that will help people live that common good Christian sort of life in our culture. So thank you guys for your Patreon support, because those funds are going to make these kinds of projects possible. Jeremy and Rebecca, the kids, are asking if you know anything about the future of VeggieTales now that they fulfilled their next Netflix deal. Short answer is no. I don't. Again, Phil's the person to talk to on that. Although the last time he and I had a conversation about VeggieTales, I'm not sure he knew about the future either. So I do know that VeggieTales has gone through different ownership over the last years, ever since it left Phil's hands, and is currently owned by Comcast Universal. So they own the property and have ultimate say on what to do with the future of it, whether they're going to produce more content, videos, movies, whatever. So I don't know where that stands. I also know that the Netflix deal is over, but my hunch is there's probably still value in those in the VeggieTales characters and audience. So they're probably going to be working on something, but I'm not sure yet. Simon, can you give a quick overview of annihilationism and how much biblical support opposition there is for it? Wow, a quick overview of annihilationism. It's 8:56 in my time zone. We have 4 minutes left. So annihilationism is simply the belief that those who do not belong to God, who are judged, experience a second death, as Scripture talks about, or as John 3:16 says, God so loved the world, he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Which not believe in Jesus is to perish or to not have eternal life. So annihilationism says the punishment that awaits those who don't belong to Christ is the cessation of their existence, that they will be annihilated, meaning they will no longer exist. They will perish. This stands in opposition to the view of eternal conscious torment, or ECT. Eternal conscious torment is kind of the traditional medieval view of hell that says you will be, that all people are eternal beings, that they live for ever and ever and ever. Some will live eternally in paradise with God, and others will live eternally in a physical torture. All of those medieval Dante kind of visions of hell. I think there's a massive amount of support in Scripture for annihilationism. In fact, I think the support is much stronger than most people realize. The best resource on this right now is probably Preston Sprinkle's podcast. Preston Sprinkle co-authored a book with Francis Chan about hell. In response to Rob Bell's book, Love Wins, they wrote this other book. Title's escaping me, but it's about hell. It's like Defending Hell or something like that. And Francis Chan and Preston Sprinkle went into Scripture, went into theology to look for all the biblical support for a traditional view of hell. And Preston Sprinkle has done a number of podcasts on this and admits that he went into the New Testament to defend the ECT approach, the eternal conscious torment approach, but he now considers himself very sympathetic to the annihilationist view. I'm not sure if he's 100% calling himself an annihilationist, but I think he's definitely more annihilationist than he is eternal conscious torment. So his podcasts on the topic are well worth listening to. They're not super long. He'll give you a basic understanding of the arguments for and against and the biblical passages to back those up. And I think he's probably written some stuff on his website about it. But yeah, so that's it in a nutshell. I do think there's a ton of support for it. Okay. Fred Clark wrote a critique of the Left Behind book series. He might be a cool guest. Yeah, not bad. I'm kind of curious about how many people still view the Left Behind books as in any way authoritative or an accurate fictional theological interpretation of what Scripture actually teaches. I mean, they were huge back in the 1990s, but 20 years on, I'm curious if they still have as much influence as they once did. Okay, guys. It is 8:59. My voice is giving out. I am congested. I'm really grateful that you joined me for this hour. Sorry for some of the technical glitches. Thank you for those of you who jumped onto Twitter and were willing to bare your souls and questions in front of the entire Twitterverse. Yeah, we'll do another one of these probably in April, so stay tuned. We'll announce it on the podcast, and we'll put a notice up on the Patreon site as well. Quick reminders, we're now releasing podcasts on Wednesday, so you can expect the next episode tomorrow. I already updated you on some of the upcoming episodes that are coming. And yeah, stay tuned on Patreon because we'll have more announcements about hopefully some more bonus material for you guys as we do these upcoming interviews. All of it can't fit on the show, so we'll put those bonus segments up for you and the other Patreon subscribers. Until then, if you have other questions, get me on my Facebook page, get me on my Twitter feed. I'll answer when I have the time. I'm traveling a ton next week, and then I'm on vacation with the family the week after that. So it'll be kind of hit and miss here for a while. But we'll have episodes for you anyway every Wednesday, and some great new content coming up. Thanks again for your support. Like I said, we couldn't do it without you, and hopefully you'll be really blessed by some of the new materials that your donations are helping us produce. So hope everyone has a great night. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you later.